How can we derive a not from an is? And how can we ground our moral values without falling into a kind of like circularity?
Okay, so we'll start with the second question because the second question's quite interesting. There's a question about what you mean when you're talking about a ground for morality, what that could be, right? Um, and there's a bunch of prior questions. One of them is going to be this. What are you talking about when you're talking about morality? Are we talking about our ordinary practices of talking about values and obligations? So on the one hand, there's kind of questions about the good. On the other hand, there are questions about the right. And so we say certain claims are wrong, we say certain acts are good. What makes those claims true? That might be the question that you're asking about the truth makers. And a view that lots of people will have is that somehow or other God is the truth maker for these claims. Right, it's got God with a capital G. So these are quite common amongst Christians to have this view that claims about what's good and what's right are grounded somehow in God. One view is that it goes by what God says. So God makes certain pronouncements, and those pronouncements kind of determine what's right and what's good. That view is going to be problematic because one of the kind of standard views here is one of the standard questions to ask is whether God's good or not. So let's suppose God is good. Presumably, it can't be that what makes God good is God saying God is good, right? That would be a vicious kind of circularity, right, of the kind that you were mentioning, right? Once you start thinking about this, it gets a bit hard to know what a foundation for morality would look like. One view, which is not particularly popular, but it's a view that I kind of like, is to think that what you want to say about truth makers for morality is very similar to what you want to say about truth makers for mathematics. So what makes it true that two and two are four? Right. Now, there are stories that you can tell. You can say there are numbers laid up in Platonic heaven, and there are operations, and somehow or other, the numbers and the operations make it true that two and two is four. I prefer a view which says there's there is no truth makers, right? It's just a necessary truth that two and two are four, and there's nothing that makes it true. What's distinctive of the necessary truths is just that they couldn't be otherwise. So you don't need a truth maker, right? And then I would like to transpose that to the case of morality as well. Consider the claim that it's wrong to torture infants solely for your own pleasure. Right? I think of that as a necessary truth. There's no truth maker for it, right? It's just it couldn't be otherwise. How could it be? I mean, you can't even conceive of circumstances, right? There are no possible circumstances in which it's okay to torture infants for your own pleasure, right? And that's kind of all you need. Now that view is controversial. What I'm committing myself there is the claim that there are moral truths, and not only that, but there are kind of necessary moral truths. People who are serious in the study of morality will know that there's lots of other positions that you might take here. You might think that you might be an error theorist like John Mackey and think that there are no moral truths, right? Morality is just a kind of mistake of a certain kind. Or you might be a certain kind of subjectivist and think that, or relativist and think that there's a kind of limited sense in which moral claims are true, namely that you're saying them makes them true for you or something like that. And there's a bunch of other ways that you might go. You might think like Kantians that we can get morality out of reason, right? So reasoning about things, thinking about the categorical imperative just kind of delivers a bunch of truths to us. It's not that they're necessary truths, they depend on facts about us, but by thinking about things in a certain kind of way, you can see that it's inescapable for us to accept certain kinds of moral principles and so on. Like there's lots of positions out there, right, about morality. The one that I favour is, I think, is not particularly popular, and it's there might well be good reasons why I shouldn't accept it, but um,
Is it a matter of preference to choose between these like big pictures of the world, or how I would like to know how your thought process is like to find the most reasonable aspects of reality to okay, I think you got it.
okay, so this is a really good question, right? Um, so maybe now it will be a good time to talk a little bit about some epistemology. Uh, there are different subject matters. So you can think of some subject matters as just belonging to common sense, right? And we're all experts in this field. What I mean, for example, is if we go outside and we look in the quadrangle and there's a big tree in the middle of the quadrangle, we'll all agree that there's a tree there. We're all experts with respect to the kind of detection of trees, right? And there's a whole lot of stuff that falls into this common sense domain. Um, our being experts about these matters is just, I think, is just a matter of our common evolutionary inheritance, right? Our capacities. And of course, there are some people who can't see, and there are some people who have other neural deficits and so on. But basically, we're just all experts in this domain, right? And there's a special story to tell about the people who aren't. Okay, that's one big set of topics. Then there's science. In the case of science, it's not that we're all experts, right? But there are experts. There are people that we should defer to because there's a whole lot of settled science, and that stuff that's settled is stuff that all the experts agree on, right? So if you want to know how far the Earth is from the sun, you don't try and work it out for yourself. You just ask one of the astronomers and they'll be able to tell you. And it doesn't matter which astronomer you pick any of them and they're going to give you the same answer, right? So when it comes to the sciences, right, there's a big domain of stuff where there are experts. Not everybody's experts, but there are experts. And we should be coordinating our opinion to what the experts say. Of course, in the sciences, there's lots of stuff that isn't settled, and some of the arguments that scientists have with one another turn out to be arguments about things that science is never going to settle. And they're arguing, I say, about philosophy, right? That we've kind of moved into philosophy of science at that point. Now, there's a third set of topics, and we all know this, right? Topics where there's no authority about the topics, right? So I'm thinking about philosophy, right? There's no central body you can go to if you've got a philosophical question and say, please tell me the answer, right? And where all of the philosophers just agree on the answer. There's politics. This works the same way. There's no world central authority that tells you what's the right view on all kinds of political questions. And the third one is religion, right? There's no central authority there either. You go and ask in Thailand, or you ask in China, or you ask in Brazil, or you ask in Rome about religious questions, and you just get different answers, right? And it's not like there's any way of sorting between them, right? So the question that I'm thinking that you are asking me is about this particular domain, the domain where there just aren't experts to consult. So what should we think about what it's reasonable to believe in these areas? There are some philosophers who say, well, we can't agree, so we should just be agnostic about everything. So Richard Feldman, for example, is a person who's defended that point of view, right? And there are some people who are sympathetic to that. But most of us want to have political opinions and religious opinions and philosophical opinions. We don't want to go down that path. And so what I think you have to do in this case is you think as hard as you can about these things. Certain things seem right to you. You think, I'm inclined to think X, Y, and Z. Of course, I recognize I can't persuade everybody else to agree with me, but that's not a reason for me not to believe it. It's perhaps a reason that I shouldn't be too dogmatic about my believing. I should, I mean, clearly I shouldn't go around telling other people that they're just wrong if they're so to take the example about morality that they were talking about, if they reject moral realism, right, that doesn't show that they're stupid or not worth taking seriously as a person or as a philosopher or anything like that. It's just that they have a view on one of these things where differences of opinion are extremely intractable. Okay, so is that a good enough answer to your question?
I believe so. I was while we were talking, I was thinking about the relation. Like we ought to seek truth, I think. But I always remember about this aspect of evolution that evolution might show us that some aspects of ourselves may evolve and adapt because of lies, and there are useful lies. So that being said, like narratives in general, do you think that in a society that a secular society, still a space for um, the classic myth, or do you think this can be abolished with reason alone?
So, so I think it matters what we're talking about. I think that with respect to common sense and with respect to science, we should think that we have the capacity to find out the truth. And we should think that our evolved capacities play a role. I mean, of course, with the common sense stuff, it's really just our capacities. They don't need much correction. When it comes to science, we have to work together and we have to work really hard in order to work out what the truth is. I mean, our evolved capacities on their own were pretty useless at telling us about physics and chemistry and things like that. But having the institutions of science has made it possible to gain a lot more knowledge. So that doesn't answer the question about what to think about religion and philosophy and politics and so on. And it is true that there are respects in which our believing is not very accurate, including our beliefs about ourselves, in ways that might actually turn out to be useful. So I'm thinking about the large amount of research in psychology that shows that most people think that they're better than average, for example. Right now, pick anything, pick any measure, and most people will think that they're better than average on it. Now, obviously, that means that most people are not believing, not most people, a lot of people are not believing accurately in that case, right? But there might be some value to that it actually helps you to deal with life better if you slightly overestimate your own capacities than if you underestimate them. You maybe it's part of what's going to contribute to leading a better life. So it may well be true that evolution actually, in certain ways, leads us to hold false beliefs that are useful, right? But it's not clear that that's a bad thing, so long as that kind of, I don't know what you want to call it, motivated thinking isn't interfering with your capacities to common sense capacities to navigate the world and your capacities to work out who the scientific experts are and what they're telling you. And it doesn't seem like it's going to affect your capacities to form beliefs about religion, politics, philosophy, and so on. Though it might make you a little bit unreasonable, might incline you a little bit more towards dogmatism than you ought. Right? But overall, I don't see any kind of conflict if you think Sure, there are ways in which evolution actually has made us such that we're inclined to form certain kinds of false beliefs, but we can navigate, we can manage that, and it might actually be good for us that we have those, that we are inclined to form certain kinds of false beliefs.
Yeah, I think the conflict exists only when we consider that both truth and the lie aspect of humankind is in the same kind of sphere, and there's no reason whatsoever to pursue truth because we must pursue only what make us survive. So uh, that's my stance.
So
Yeah.
yeah, right. So the answer to that is that or at least in the domain of common sense, right? If over time your capacities are not being more finely tuned to the truth about your environment, you just lose out to the creatures whose capacities are more finely tuned
Oh.
to the environment. So you would expect that we're going to be pretty good when it comes to the domains where our so go back to the example of whether there's a tree in the quad, right? People who can see, but I mean, you can't even really kind of make sense of this, right? Or I mean, make it instead of a tree, make it something edible, tomato plants or something. Those of us who can detect the tomatoes and can see that they're okay are going to do better than the people who can't detect the tomatoes or can't tell that they're okay to eat, right? So there's a kind of an impetus in evolution for over time for these kinds of discriminatory capacities to get more and more accurate, right? So you wouldn't predict, um, yeah, if you understand the way that this is working, you're not going to be predicting that there could be creatures who are just systematically misperceiving the world in those respects. Whereas you can get out of evolution the idea that we kind of systematically overestimate our own abilities, given that we can see ways in which that might be conducive to survival. And that's fine, right? It's just not a generalizable thing. If there are cases where we're kind of systematically set up to be self-deceived or to believe falsehoods or whatever, there'll be special cases.
Okay, good.
Professor,
So,
what is the naturalistic metaphysics that you defend?
So what is the...
What is the naturalist metaphysics that you defend?
Okay, great. So people, just like with atheism, people mean different things by naturalism. What I mean by naturalism, what I think is really central to naturalism is a claim about the universe, causal reality. So I think that think of causal reality as the network of everything that's causally related. I think that there are none but natural causes and they have none but natural causal properties. So that rules out any kinds of supernatural or non-natural causes, right? So it rules out not just things like ghosts, but things like God and gods as well. So it's distinctive of naturalism that it commits itself to restricting the domain of causes to the natural causes. I also think that it's distinctive of naturalism that naturalists will say, well, if you want to find out what causal things there are, you ask the scientists. I mean, there's common sense that tells you about a whole lot of stuff. You know about birds, for example, because you can see them and interact with them. You know that there are those kinds of causal things. But if people are claiming to believe in things and those are not things that there's just universal common sense agreement on their existence, and there is an expert scientific agreement on their existence, then you've got the best of reasons for being skeptical that there are such things. That's kind of the naturalistic attitude. So it's a combination of a kind of metaphysical claim about the extent of causal reality and a kind of epistemic claim about the sources that you should use in order to identify what causal things there are. So that's what I think naturalism is.
Okay, Professor, I have actually a silly question for you. Do you have any, how can I say it? Do you find any theist arguments strong enough to be reasonable, or do you think all theist arguments are kind of flawed? And do you think that your particular position may be flawed in somehow, or do you think you it's better and it's more consistent than the opposite?
Okay, so there's two different kinds of questions that you asked me, some questions about arguments and some questions about theories. So I'll go to the argument side first. For a long time, I've defended the view that there are no successful arguments for or against the existence of gods. I mean, there are plenty of unsuccessful arguments. Everybody on both sides is going to agree that, but I think that there aren't any successful arguments on either side. That kind of comes out quite naturally if you have, if you kind of bear in mind that there are just no experts in, say, philosophy, in particular in philosophy of religion, in particular in the part of philosophy of religion that bears on arguments about that, that bears on whether there's a God and what the God's properties might be and so on, right? Because were there such experts, there would be good arguments, whichever way it went, right? So what I think you find, if you look very closely at either arguments for the existence of God or arguments against the existence of God, is that where those arguments are such that the conclusion actually would be supported by the premises, right? The conclusion in some sense is a consequence of the premises. It turns out that amongst the premises, there are some claims that people who don't accept the conclusion reject, right? And that always turns out to be the case, according to me. And so you go and look at arguments from evil and you ask theists what they think about various arguments from evil, and they'll always, where those arguments are well constructed, they'll always be able to find at least one premise and say, I don't believe that premise. Right? And so the argument's not successful once you think about whether there's something here that should cause theists to cease being theists. The answer is going to be no. There are no arguments that have that property. Okay, so that's on the side of arguments. On the side of theories, I'm inclined to the view that we should think that there's, and I mean, again, going back to this question about philosophy, politics, and religion, one view that you could take, the Feldman view, is that it's not reasonable to accept any theories in these domains. If you don't go that way, then what I think you should do is be quite concessive and think there's lots of reasonable positions here, right? There's no position that stands out as the right one, such that everybody can just recognize that it's the right one. But there's a whole range of positions here that intelligent people adopt and that they can say sensible things about, right? Without being able to come up with anything that's sufficient to kind of persuade everybody else to gravitate to that position. So my answer to that half of the question about theories, is that there's a wide spectrum of reasonable opinion. That's not to say that there aren't lots of positions that are bad, right? Lots of people have contradictory views. they ought to modify something if their view's contradictory. There are people, lots of people who have views that are kind of suboptimal because they've made certain inferences to the best explanation where they haven't inferred to what by their lights ought to be the explanation that they're inferring to, and so on. Right. So I'm not claiming that everything in the area is reasonable. What I'm claiming is, for example, that if you look at what professional philosophers of religion say, they disagree enormously with one another, but it seems reasonable in most cases to think that their views are reasonable.
Okay, all right. So, Jose, do you have, I think you're dying to ask another question. Do you have something for Professor Oppy?
Yes. Professor Oppy, what is divine hiddenness, and does the problem of evil remain a weak point from theism?
Okay, so let's start with the second question. Considerations about evil have long been thought to be difficult for people who believe in an omnipotent, omniscient, perfectly good God, perfect God of some kind. I mean, there are lots of cultures where there's belief in gods or even a single God that doesn't have those features, and then it's not so clear that evil's a problem. I mean, there are cultures, at least historically, where you had two gods, one good and one evil, that interacted. Evil's not particularly a problem for those views, I don't think, and so on. So we're thinking now about something that's kind of, it's not just the Abrahamic religions, because there are kind of Indian traditions where you get problems of evil that come up because you've got some sort of conception of perfection for the supreme deity there as well. Given what I said before, you should be able to predict that I'm going to say that if you're a perfect being theist, you're going to have answers to the range of questions about evil. There's a wide range of them. You might wonder why there's anything imperfect at all. You might wonder why there are certain things like the Holocaust that were allowed to happen. You might wonder why evolutionary history seems so cruel. Animals have been suffering enormously for 1 billion years or more. Maybe it's not quite that long, maybe 500 million years. I mean, it depends exactly where you think suffering cuts in. And then if you happen to believe in hell, there's the questions about how a perfectly good God could possibly devise a setup where you have lots of people suffering infinitely, suffering misery for an infinite amount of time and so on. Right, so there are various questions about evil, and theists will have different answers to those, right? So that's a very short thing about some points about evil. Recently, Eugen Nagasawa has written a book in which he argues that there's a problem of evil for atheists that's just as severe as the problem of evil for theists, because he thinks if you kind of push, atheists will say that on balance they think that life is good, but when you look at the kind of history of evolution, he thinks it's hard to square that with the view that that attitude that life is good with the facts about the history of evolution. And he thinks that atheists are not very well placed to respond to that difficulty, whereas theists at least have some resources. I won't discuss that further here. I'm just pointing out that there's a range of questions even about the relationship between evil and whether you're a theist or an atheist. Okay, so that's kind of problem of evil. Divine hiddenness. So John Schellenberg, in the last guess it's getting on for 20 years, maybe it's a bit more than 20 years now, has argued that there's a problem for perfect being theists that lies in the case of people who are non-believers, but not because they're resistant to believing in God, but because they just haven't been given any evidence that God exists. So God's hidden from them, hence the problem of hiddenness. And Schellenberg thinks that this is a serious problem for perfect being theists, because he thinks that it's quite obvious that there's lots of sort of non-culpably, non-resistant non-believers, people who don't believe, but it's got nothing, it's not through any fault of their own. There are various things that theists say in response to Schellenberg's argument, but it's interesting, the problem of what's called the problem of divine hiddenness. So Schellenberg's arguments have got lots and lots of airtime in the last 20 years, and some of the kind of traditional problems of evil have gotten comparatively less airtime in recent discussion. Is that enough about that?
I think that's great. I don't know what Jose thinks about, but I think it's great. If Jose permits, I want to ask you about the problem of infinite regress, and if you consider it a problem at all.
Okay. So this is a great topic. There's so much, as with all of these topics, there's so much to say about them. So one thought that was quite common in antiquity was that the past is infinite, right? There's always been a universe, right? And it doesn't have an origin. It's just for each past stage, there's an earlier past stage, which is a way of saying that it's infinite. Yeah. That view was contradicted by the Abrahamic religions, who insisted that at a certain point in time, the universe came into existence as a result of divine creation. And there are kind of these philosophical arguments that you could make defending one view or the other. And so there's a long history. You can see it in the Islamic tradition, some of the Kalam philosophers producing arguments that was, and they may have got them from Philoponus, who I think was probably not Islamic, right? But anyway, the way the history goes, there are these philosophical arguments, both for the claim that the past is infinite and for the claim that the past is finite. When you get to Kant presents this as one of the kind of antinomies of reason. The arguments are equally good, right? According to Kant, right? And that's a problem. A kind of wrinkle on this discussion that appears in the early 20th century, when there are kind of models for general relativity that have a finite past, and there's evidence gradually accumulates that there was a big bang, that our causal history traces back to this very big explosion. Now, maybe there's some history before that, right? So that the empirical evidence doesn't prove that the people who think that the past is finite were correct. But you still might think that there's at least some kind of evidence here for a finite past. My own view is kind of ambivalent about this. I think that infinite past is kind of weird. I do think that there are models you can make, cosmological models, that will give you an infinite past. And one way of doing this is to suppose that there's a multiverse, and there are kind of bubbles in the multiverse that nucleate. All right. And so for any particular universe, it's got a finite history. It's just that the multiverse itself has an infinite past. That gives you a kind of infinite causal history. But if you put my toes to the fire and you say I've got to make a choice, I lean slightly in favor of the idea that the past is finite. Yeah. But I wouldn't I'm not. I don't have a deep investment in this. I certainly don't think that that there are any considerations that absolutely rule out an infinite past.
Okay, great. I always think about entropy, but I believe that someone has a explanation if past is infinite, entropy may be justified. But let me see. I have a question that Jose asked me to basically ask you before the interview. I have written over here is what is your response to the criticisms raised by Balint Bekif, I think it's his name, regarding your approach to comparative theor theoretical virtues, I think. Um, his name,
Okay.
Balint Bekif, I think is his name.
Yes. So there have been a few people who've written. Okay, so maybe I should start by saying something about the views about theory choice that
Okay.
I've kind of borrowed from philosophy of science. So suppose we've got some data and we've got two theories that, and we're trying to assess which is the better theory given the data. Then, according to me, what we do is we work. There are two dimensions that matter. One is how complicated the theories are, their relative complexity. And the other thing that matters is whether they explain the data or not. So how much of the data they explain. And what we're going to do is pick the theory that does best at doing two things simultaneously, kind of minimizing complexity and maximizing explanation. Right? And so I want to apply that idea to theory choice when we're imagining choosing between a theistic theory and a naturalistic theory. Right? So what we should be doing is asking, which one does better at managing this trade-off? Now, one way that we could answer that question would be if one of the theories is just clearly simpler, and it's also obvious that it's not the other theory that does better at explanation. Right. So in my book, The Best Argument Against God, this is the way I argue. I say naturalism is clearly simpler. It commits you to less. Right. One way to think about that, this is a bit too simplistic, but it will do, is both are committed to the universe, but the naturalist says that's all there is, and the theist says, no, wait, there's more. There's God, there's the angels, there's heaven, and so on, lots more stuff. Right. So naturalism is simpler. On the other hand, when you think about what needs explaining, so think about all the stuff that's given to us in experience, say, there's nothing that theism explains better than naturalism, according to me. Now, that's controversial, and we can break that down. We can ask whether, for example, theism it does a better job of explaining morality or the fine-tuning of the universe or causal history or any number of things, right? And so the burden of the argument is to go through and in every case argue that the naturalist is doing at least as well as the theist, but that will give you an argument. Now, I'm quite happy to allow, and I do this in that book that I mentioned, that people might do this assessment differently, right? And so while I think it's hard to deny that naturalism is simpler, you might think there's a bunch of things that theism explains better than naturalism, and on balance, we should be theists rather than naturalists. I'm not going to say that you're irrational if you judge it that way, right? So I'm not here contradicting what I said earlier about how there are no successful arguments in this domain. Okay, so that's my view. The criticisms that I've got, including the one that you mentioned, suppose that I'm saying something about epistemology, that you can't be a naturalist or a theist until you get the best theories, compare them, do this stuff, right? So, and I mean, I don't, that's a kind of misunderstanding. I don't think that in order to be justified, you have to have done this comparison. We can't do the comparison. We certainly can't assemble best theories of anything, never mind hold two of them in mind and do this kind of comparison. The point that I was making with this discussion was not one epistemological one or one about method. It was one about argument, really, right? I mean, if you think about trying to settle whether we should be theists or naturalists, you should think about it in this way. But that's a completely different question from whether you're rational in being a theist or a naturalist right now, which isn't going to be based on something like that. It'll be based on the way that you've dealt with various information that's come to you, including the testimony that you've got from all kinds of people, because it may well be that you formed your beliefs about these matters when you were a very young child, when you were just told certain things by your uncles or your priest or whoever it is. And that's really significant because once you've got beliefs, it's unlikely that there's going to be enough evidence to shift you out of them. Right. I mean, it could be that something happens. And there are lots of stories about conversion, one way or the other, people who lose their faith, people who find their faith. But that sort of stuff, we're now talking about something really different. We're talking about the ways in which we update belief in the course of experience. We're now really talking about something in epistemology. That's just a completely different topic from the one that I was talking about when I was talking about the kind of theory comparison and imagining kind of the best theories and so on. So I think that the papers that criticised me just misunderstood what I was doing, right? And taught me to be talking about a topic that was quite different from the one that I was actually talking about. So that's the one in particular that you're mentioning. That's what I think happened. Yeah.
Okay, great. I'd like to know how a belief may come about. How may we form a belief? And your stance on free will in general.
Okay, so those are two separate topics for me. So the forming belief. So a lot of the beliefs that we form, we do in the following way. Someone tells you something and you just believe what they say, right? We do an awful lot of that and we continue to do that, right? Now, in the case of information about the environment, you know, the common sense stuff, that's harmless, right? I mean, if it's not entirely harmless if someone is making mistakes and is giving you the wrong information, but it's easily corrected, right? When it comes to scientific stuff, where it's slightly more complicated because you can end up with false beliefs about who the experts are about the sciences, or you can end up with false beliefs about where reliable information about the sciences is stored and so on. And it's not straightforward to correct if you're in the unfortunate position that you're believing has been corrupted in one of those ways. But it's also not too hard if you really want to know what the expert opinion on something is. It's not that hard so long as you're not completely benighted to find it out. Okay. And so there's lots of stuff that you get told that you just believe, and that's the right thing to do. Okay, so that's about sources of belief, right? That's how most of your believing works, right? There's some stuff that you try and work out for yourself, and it depends on the domain that we're in, whether that's sort of the right way to think about it. And then there are these other questions about whether you're doing it well or not. There is this idea that lots of people have that you should think for yourself. It's not so clear that that's really good advice when it comes to, for example, scientific matters. Okay, so that was a little bit about believing. The other question was about free will. So for a long time, I was quite happy just to count myself as a compatibilist. All right. So I think that free will is plausibly compatible. with determinism. However, for almost as long, I've been inclined to think that the world's not deterministic, right? Because of quantum mechanics, but you might have other reasons as well. So then there's this question about whether compatibilism is particularly interesting, right? If the world's not deterministic, then it doesn't really, the kind of central question isn't going to be about whether free will is compatible with determinism, right? What I think though is that there are different ways of thinking about freedom, and the right way to think about what freedom is the kind of way that compatibilists typically think about freedom. So I act freely just in case I act on my normally acquired beliefs, desires, intentions, and so on, in the absence of certain kinds of defeating conditions. So, I'm not imprisoned, I'm not drugged, I'm not suffering from some depression or something like that. So long as I'm a normal person in normal circumstances, if I can put it that way, and I'm acting on beliefs, desires, and intentions that I acquired in just the usual way, then when I make decisions, I'm making free decisions. That's the way that I think about freedom. It's very similar, I think, to the way that Dan Dennett thought about what freedom is. Now, there are people who think that's just not freedom. When I'm talking about freedom, what I mean is that is something like this. In the circumstances in which I'm acting, I'm doing one thing, but I could have done another without there being any changes in the circumstances. Right? That strikes me as just being sheer randomness, right? Right? I do this one thing, but I could have done another thing. I'm set up a certain way, but that doesn't have any implications for what I do. Right? So I don't think of that as any genuine kind of freedom. So that's what used to get called libertarian freedom. People who once were libertarians tend to have retreated to a slightly different position where they think that in order to act freely, it has to be that in some sense you're in control of what you're doing. Right? But I'm inclined to think that when we unpack what it is for you to be in control, it just means that you're acting on your beliefs, desires, intentions, and so on. And so we can just kind of wrap that up into the compatibilist conception of freedom. Right? So it's important, just to end this, that there's a big debate. The biggest debate here is about what freedom is. Right? People have very different ideas about what freedom is. And that influences the kinds of things that people then go on to say about whether we've got it, for example.